Once again, we've decided to traverse that dark and disorienting wood, folklore. And once again, we fully expected to lose our way. That's the trick of this wilderness, after all. However well you think you recognize the landmarks, however well kept the paths and the signposts may be, ultimately each tree looks exactly like the next. Here are myth and tale tangled up in the same copse, and no useful opinions on how to distinguish them. We've tried to make our own paths before, but ultimately ended up lost deeper in the brush than we began. Luckily, the denizens of this forest have been more than willing to show us the way. Slavic folklore has been unique in its capacity to illustrate the relationship and the boundaries between myth and tale. Of course, that doesn't make the wood entirely safe to travel. There are also things that live here which have a taste for deception and blood. Before I begin my tangent, I do have something else I'd like to share with all of you. I told you in our recent H.P. Lovecraft episode about the letters I've been receiving, the ones written by someone inside the facility just beyond the Foundry. Well, whoever they are, they're still at it, and we'd like to start reading you some of what they've been sending. So make sure you stick around until the very end of the video. Maybe we can finally start to get some answers here. But that's for later. For now, let's get back to mapping out Slavic folklore. The first thing we were struck by when we started our delving here was the impressive groundwork that had already been laid out. It seems there was a big push among Russian folklorists from the 19th century into the early 20th to collect and to analyze their folkloric materials. Granted, this research isn't going to reflect all the folk stories unique to each and every Slavic culture, but it provides by far the greatest wealth of academic material pertaining to any set of folk stories from any of them, which is pretty significant. What we've found in all of this research is 3 distinct genres of Slavic folk story that bleed into each other surprisingly little. First, we have Belichki, anecdotes and memories about personal experiences people have had with the supernatural. This is about as close as we're going to get to discussing Slavic religious myth in this video, as this is the category in which you'll find the household spirits, like the domovoi and the banik, the wilderness spirits, such as the leshi and the rusalka, and a plethora of semi-religious beings, like Det Moroz and the Nav, most of which have received or continue to receive some minor form of reverence. Second, we have Belini, or Starini, depending on who you ask. Bardic tales about epic heroes called bogatyr, told in the form of song or poetry, and greatly embellished with both hyperbole and fantasy. They're often pseudo-historical, presenting fictionalized versions of real people like the dragon slayer Dobrynya Nikitich. Others, like Ilya Muromets, greatest of the bogatyr, are pure fiction. Third and finally, we have the most fastidiously collected of the 3, the skazki, essentially Slavic fairy tales. A lot of work has gone into the categorization and collection of these in particular, and as a result, they present some of the most well-known tales in all of Slavic folklore, including the death of Koshchei the Deathless, Vasilisa the Beautiful, and of course, countless stories that feature the Witch of the Wilds herself, Baba-yaga. If you aren't familiar, Baba-yaga is for many the face of Slavic folklore. Not just because she flies around in a pestle and mortar, sweeping away her tracks with a broom, not because her house stands on a pair of giant chicken legs, not because of her taste for Russian blood, her iron teeth, or her hideous visage, not for any of her material characteristics, however fascinating they may be. Baba-yaga is perhaps the most recognizable figure in Slavic folklore because she breaks the compartmentalization of genres. As I said before, Belichki, Belini, and Skazki bleed very little into one another, but like the wild cannibal of the wood that she is, Baba-yaga makes them bleed. We'll get back to this in a moment. If we're going to make sense of the role Baba-yaga plays, we first need to connect some dots. I said at the beginning of the video that all of this somehow informed our understanding of myth and tale. Because the stories have been so successfully gathered into genres, if we can nest those genres into even broader categories, we can use their interactions to reach some really interesting, more generalized conclusions. So that's what we've done. Myth, by our reckoning, is any story that originates from or changes through mimetic circulation. That is, circulation via adaptation or mimicry. This includes religious myth, supernatural myth, rumor, legend, etc. Thus, both Belichki and Bellini are myth. Belichki because they're so anecdotal, mostly first-hand accounts from the narrator with no distinguishable primary source, easily adaptable and mutable by any given storyteller. And Bellini because they're so performative, largely stories recycled or embellished through bardic storytelling traditions. They're both primarily oral, so they're both subject to that telephone effect we described in our H.P. Lovecraft episode. Tale, on the other hand, we consider to be any story with an arc plot. That is, a story which more or less adheres to classic design, involving a single active protagonist, a linear time frame, causality, an external conflict, and a closed ending. Very different from more avant-garde literary works. We put Сказки and, yet again, Bellini into this category. Сказки because of the archetypal, heavily structured nature of Slavic fairy tales, and Bellini because of the similarly archetypal and very meticulous structure of the bardic tellings. Of course, you can see simply by the way we place Bellini that these two categories aren't mutually exclusive. A myth can have an arc plot, and a tale can be subject to mimetic circulation. Thus, we begin to map out the parts of the wood and to trace the subtle paths that run between. But don't forget, we also warned you of the danger in traversing this wilderness. Despite any map we might provide, you can never truly escape that hungry old woman and her gnarled, grasping hands. I began to say before that Baba-yaga has a place in Belichki, Bellini, and Сказки each, and that's true. Her appearance in Belichki is that of a vaguely supernatural being, a bogeyman to naughty children, a sort of deity to others. In the Bellini, she makes an out-of-place but precedent-setting appearance in at least one tale as an aid to the hero Ilya Muromets. But the Сказки are her true home. It is here that she is most frequently depicted and in the greatest detail. It's impossible to determine which of these genres she originates from, but there's an intrinsic feedback loop here. Details from all three groups inform and alter one another, creeping inevitably into her overall character. Though she can stand alone as either a mythic being or a fairy tale figure depending on the story, she is the promise that myth and tale can never be perfectly separated. This is one of the reasons mythology is such a confusing topic. No matter how well organized the folklore, there will always be these agents of confusion that cross all boundaries and throw all attempts at categorization into question. Thus, for us, Slavic folklore has been a brilliant navigational tool. We can see now where lies the myth, the tale, and the confusing tangle of branches between them. Phew. Okay. That was a very dense subject. Hopefully it wasn't too convoluted in the end. We'll get more into the fun stuff with our upcoming list video, where we'll cover some of the specific creatures from Slavic folklore. After that, of course, another short story. This time we'll be adapting our own tale from the shreds of Slavic myth. If you're curious about some of the culture and the history attached to this, I can make no better recommendation than that you go and watch The Animated History of Russia over on our friend Sweeney's YouTube channel. He's made a good deal of these things, so if this one catches your interest, be sure to stick around and watch the rest, and let him know that we said to keep making stuff up. Even though he doesn't, because his channel is about history. It's the thought that counts. And while you're waiting on the rest of our Slavic folklore series, if you're hankering for some good fiction that makes use of all of this material in the meantime, fret not. There's plenty available, and by far better narrators than I am, over at audible.com. Sign up for a free 1-month trial using the link in the description, and you'll get access to 2 free audiobooks of your choice from Audible's catalog of over 100,000 titles. This time, the Tale Foundry team has to recommend The Bear and the Nightingale by Catherine Arden. It is a dangerously beautiful novel-length fairy tale about the relationship between folk belief and organized religion, and the pages are positively flooded with cameos from all of your favorite folklore creatures. If you like what you heard in this video, you'll have a great time with this book. And, of course, it definitely doesn't hurt that this is just a free way to support the show. For a more intimate way to contribute, you can also join us on Patreon, where you'll have access to votes to help us decide on topics, sneak peeks, even think tank sessions where you'll get to talk to the team about each video before it comes out. Each pledge brings us that much closer to acquiring the tools we'll need to uncover the rest of the strange facility beyond the Foundry. Speaking of which, before we end the video, I think it's about time I shared this letter with you. I have to warn you though, it is a bit bizarre. Keep in mind as I read that all of the following was in response to the simple question, "Who are you?" Lo, at last the tide doth return mine query. But it is tragedy. I had contrived to bottle a message in hopes that it would return with such revelation and intrigue. Instead, I receive scrutiny and reduction. I shall, however, attempt for the sake of the sender to bear all appearance of grace. If I were to answer this question of who, dear sender, it would be a disservice to you and to myself and to the whole of worthy experience. Would you also have me attribute a face to the climbing suspense before the final act? Shall I give name to that glorious anxiety of secrets withheld? I shall instead give you a more apt query then. What? And this I have already begun to say. I can say very honestly that I have no idea what to do with this. I will definitely be writing back, but what am I supposed to say to that? Something to think on, I suppose. Suggestions are more than welcome. At any rate, that's all for this episode. Thanks for watching, and keep making stuff up. We'll see you next time. До свидания.